what I mean by the policy presumption is a view of the world which is still very prevalent in Whitehall and Westminster. And actually, and I say this as someone on the kind of left, in my own views, actually particularly prevalent amongst kind of social democrats, which is one of the reasons why I think the left is in trouble in so many places. And that's a view that thinks about change as being driven primarily by the traditional instruments of policy. So that's government legislation, regulation, and also the allocation of funding pots for different specified purposes. And that really is the way that I viewed things for a very long time as a Labour Party official, as the director of IPPR, which is one of our leading, arguably our leading over the last 15 years, conventional think tank, and how I thought as head of policy in Downing Street and head of political strategy in Downing Street. But I think that that view of the world, that policy presumption as I call it, which is if there's a problem we need a new policy, is increasingly untenable. And by the way, it isn't simply politicians and the people who advise politicians who are guilty of the policy presumption. The media are guilty of it too, because whenever anything goes wrong, their first instinct is to demand a policy to remedy it. And actually, to be honest, probably most of us are guilty of it as well. I'm sure many of us, at many times, have signed petitions, gone on demos, argued at dinner parties or whatever that we need a new policy to solve a problem. Now, don't get me wrong, we have to have policy, and of course, given that policy is simply a word we use to describe a mechanism by which we try to achieve a change, not having policies is of course a policy. But what I mean by the policy presumption is a focus on those particular central government mechanisms to achieve change: legislation, regulation, allocated funding pots. That is the best way to achieve lots of changes, and if we're going to have policy, it's important that policy is good. So it's important that we have good think tanks, and we have wise politicians, and we have good civil servants. But actually, if you look at the record of policy, big policy, it's not really that impressive, to be honest. So it's not just the kinds of examples that are in a wonderful book by Ivor Crewe and Tony King called The Blunders of Our Government. If you want an entertaining read over Christmas, I strongly recommend this book to you. It's an extremely entertaining account of a dozen of the worst policy mistakes of government in the last 20 years, a kind of forensic critique of the Child Support Agency, the London Underground public-private partnership, the poll tax, ID cards, individual learning accounts. The list goes on. So, on the one hand, there's just been a lot of really, really bad stuff that has wasted a hell of a lot of money and achieved nothing. Worse than nothing in some cases. But on the other hand, if you look at the last 20 or 30 years of public service reform, what happens in around the kind of late 70s is there's an acceleration of public service reform. Before that, policy kind of evolves within policy communities. It's much more consensual. Ministers, civil servants, trade unions, stakeholders, they kind of work on stuff together in a kind of incremental process. And there are problems with that. There are kind of received wisdoms within that policy community. But in the late 70s, in the context of a broader critique of the effectiveness of government and the welfare state, we move into a kind of process of hyper-reform, which we've been in ever since, really, where all public services are subject, and welfare state as well, subject to a continuous process of reform, where there is never, literally never a time when there aren't major root and branch reforms being undertaken in every single one of our major public services. The sum total of that 35 years of frenetic energy, I'd say we're probably in no better place than we would have been had we done almost none of that, but simply left it to professionals and local agencies and citizens to try and work out the best way of doing things. maybe a little bit better in some areas, probably a little bit worse in other areas. So the charge sheet against traditional policy is quite a kind of damning charge sheet. So that's kind of the history. But actually, those things which make policy, that kind of top-down traditional policy, unlikely to succeed, have actually accelerated dramatically in the last few years and will accelerate further in the future. So the kinds of things that make that kind of traditional policy making problematic is the pace of change in the world. And of course, in all sorts of ways, change is accelerating. What makes it difficult is people's capacity to respond to stuff and not do what you expect them to do. And of course that has changed and accelerated through social media in particular. What makes it more difficult is if people are bolshy and don't do what they're told. Well, you know, you're younger than me, you're even bolshier than me, you're even less likely to do what you're told, you're even less likely to defer to politicians and to trust them. And complexity, of which all those things are part. A world of ever greater complexity. So the way in which policymakers think traditionally, and you know, there's always been better policy making than the policy making I'm described, but this is the kind of ideal type. It's kind of like a scientific experiment. So the way scientists do undertake an experiment is they try to stop anything else changing. They try to hold everything else stable so they can study the effect of the one intervention which they're undertaking in the test tube or in the laboratory or in their experiment. And the traditional policy-making view kind of is that view of the world, which is you undertake a major welfare reform, everything else stays stable, people don't change, nothing moves. Your policy is implemented without any kind of ramifications or knock-on effects on anything else. No other policies are going to impact your policy. You're going to implement your policy and it's going to succeed. Well, I mean, this is an entirely fantastical view of the world as it actually is. So, to conclude this kind of part of what I have to say, what that means, I think, is that we need to develop a different set of ways of thinking about how we achieve change in the world. We have to recognise that sometimes you do need traditional policy, and as I've said before, if you do have traditional policy, it's much better that it will be good policy than bad policy. But there are three other things which you should do a lot more of instead of traditional national policy making. One is to devolve power, and it's interesting that this coalition government and then Conservative government, which I disagree with about lots of things, has actually done some quite impressive stuff in terms of devolving power to cities and city regions. I think that there is a global trend towards devolving power to cities and city regions for a whole variety of reasons, but mainly to do with the fact that if public engagement and responsiveness are really big problems, you want to be closer to people when you make decisions, and you want to be closer to the implementation of those decisions so you can learn more quickly about what's going well and what's going badly. Across the world, mayors are more popular than prime ministers and presidents. It's a kind of, not all mayors and not all prime ministers, but if you look at the relative popularity of these two groups of politicians, mayors are much, much, much more popular than presidents and prime ministers. And I think it's because governance at that kind of city level, that local level, is more effective in the modern world. The second thing we should do more of is methodologies like collective impact. Collective impact is a methodology that's been used in the States and other places. Collective impact really is a way of thinking about change from the very beginning in terms of the coalition of different organisations and interests you need to bring together in order to be able to achieve kind of system reform. And I want to give you an example of where, had a government pursued that way of thinking, it would have achieved transformational change, but because it didn't, it hasn't. And that's Tony Blair's announcement in 1998, I think, of Labour's intention to abolish child poverty. So let me just say, first of all, actually the Labour government and the much despised Tony Blair achieved more progress on reducing child poverty than any government has ever done in modern history. Not a fact you'll hear very often or read about in The Guardian very often, but nevertheless. But still, even though 500,000 children were lifted out of poverty by the Labour government. That commitment to abolishing child poverty has now gone by the board, and in fact the only debate now in government is about how to redefine poverty in a way which makes it possible to suggest that there is improvement. So why did that happen? Well, in my view, it happened for a mistake which I didn't spot at the time, which was that what happened was that Tony Blair announced the abolition of child poverty in a speech. I was there. It was amazing. Amazing. He said, we're going to abolish child poverty. The Labour government's going to abolish child poverty. What, of course, he should have said was this. He should have said, I have a vision, a dream, a hope that we could abolish child poverty as a nation. There's absolutely no way that I can do this on my own, or that government can do it on its own. So I am pledging to be back in this same room in a year's time. And I will tell you three things. One, is Britain up for this? Because I'm going to spend the next year asking people whether they're committed to this. Churches, trade unions, businesses, people in poverty, all sorts of people. Two, I'll tell you about the pledges I've received. I'll tell you about what people are committed to doing to help this happen. And then three, I'll tell you what government will do to support Britain in achieving this amazing goal that we've set for ourselves. I believe, had he done that, not only would he have got that support and those pledges, but also even this government would have felt it was politically impossible to move away from that target because people had such a sense of ownership of it. And if that sounds far-fetched as a way of thinking about government, check out what Justin Trudeau, the new Premier of Canada, has been saying since he was elected unexpectedly a few weeks ago, because the first thing he said, just about the first thing he said, was help. He said, I've got all sorts of ideas about things I want to do for Canada, but I can't do them on my own. I need the states to help me. I need civil society to help me. So I'm asking from day one, as your newly elected Premier, elected on the tide of public support, I'm not saying I'm the big I am. I'm not saying I'm going to change the world. I'm saying help. And it went down very, very well. And if you are going to say help, say it the day after you've been elected, not 3 years after you've been elected when you failed to do the things you thought you could do. And then the third way in which we should be thinking about things differently is to use a lot more of the tools from the toolkit that a designer would use. Now, there's quite a lot of hype about design thinking, and I'm kind of currently in the my mode of thought at the moment is that we need a kind of second wave of design thinking, because design thinking has become too ubiquitous and it's become almost meaningless. But notwithstanding the fact that I think we need to have some clarity and to refresh what we mean by design thinking, I still think that the way that designers think about the world, which has 3 or 4 characteristics of great policy making, by the way, but not characteristics of conventional policy making. First of all, spend a hell of a lot of time asking yourself, are we asking the right question? Policymakers have a terrible tendency to assume that they know. Here's our answer. He says, I liked Miles Jupp's kids who walk back up slides. So walking back up slides, that's the thing that is something that should go in room 101. And Len Goodman, you know Len Goodman from Strictly? His 3 were decimalisation, all foreign food, and choice. So I'll just say thank you on your behalf. So there we are. So design thinking, yeah. First of all, spend a lot of time asking whether we're asking the right question. Secondly, spend a lot of time actually looking at what people do. So, politicians ask people what they think, which is a really crap guide to anything. What is a much better guide to things is what people actually do. It is kind of like a big version of desire lines. You know what I mean by desire lines? So, you go to a park and there's the path, but it isn't actually the quickest way from the 2 corners. So people have created another path based on going the fastest route. So imagine that 1,000 times over. Designers will think very hard about how people actually do things, how they actually use them. And they think that people's behaviours are much more significant, generally speaking, than their opinions. Or if they are going to ask their opinions, they'll immerse them properly in really thinking about stuff and helping to design stuff. And then thirdly, policymakers hate it when things go wrong. I've worked in government, and the first thing you do when things go wrong with the minister's policy is don't tell them in the hope that it will correct itself. So politicians don't really like it when things go wrong. Designers, they can't enjoy it when things go wrong, really, because it's an opportunity to learn. And so the designing approach of kind of rapid prototyping and testing things out. So most designers will tell you that the best stuff they've ever done is because they tried something out and it failed and they learned something from it, and so it goes on. And so that kind of rapid prototyping, failing and learning kind of methodology is much, much more suited to the modern world than the old policymaker view, which is hold everything stable. I'm going to spend 5 years developing an idea and 10 years implementing it and 5 years finding out it didn't work. So that's my starting point when we're talking about how it is you change the world, and about influencing policy, is to say that I think we need to move away from the policy presumption. And I'm describing something I think is actually happening, but it should be accelerated. So the next two things I'm going to say, I'll say more briefly, but I want to talk now about the RSA. And I'm kind of partly doing this because I want to boast, but I'm also doing it because I think it tells you something about how hard you have to be willing to work and think if you really want to become effective as an organisation. So the RSA, I've been there 9 years. Basically, the RSA's model, when I inherited the organisation, was that we had a group of fellows who gave us money, and then we used that money to instigate research projects, and then we would produce learned reports, which generally speaking would die a death. Nobody read them, no one took any notice of them. So that's what we were, kind of, fellows gave us the money, we had a little research team, the trustees decided what they thought was interesting, we did the research, sometimes it got a bit of impact, a lot of the time it didn't. And there were other things that we did from time to time that were more successful, but that was the kind of basic model. So what I've spent all these years at the RSA doing, and I've made lots of mistakes along the way, is trying to get to the point which we've now got to. And that point is about saying, actually, the RSA has got a number of different resources. So the least important is the house that we are in, just down the road in John Adams Street. It's a beautiful house, you should visit it sometime. And that's nice, it's a headquarters and people like to visit it, and it's a great place to hold our events. But the three most important resources we've got is we've got a kind of platform for ideas. So we have got the capacity to get our ideas out to a lot of people quite quickly. We've got 500,000 Facebook followers. We have all our lectures go online. We have a product called Animate, which has been a kind of global phenomenon. I think the most watched Animate lecture has been watched 20 million times around the world. That's a 12-minute lecture, not a cat being flushed down a toilet. It's, serious. In fact, we had a lecture about Marxism, which we turned into an Animate, David Harvey lecture about the Marxist critique of the credit crunch. So it's 13 minutes of Marxist critique of the credit crunch, and that's been watched 2.5 million times. And it even provoked a group of American students, neoliberal students, to produce a counter animation because they were so worried that this propaganda would change the world. So we have this capacity to reach the world. Secondly, we've got our research, and we do a lot of research in a lot of different areas. The focus of our work is what we call the power to create. So what we're interested in is how do you expand the scope of human agency? How do you give more people a greater sense of their capacity to turn ideas into reality, to be the authors of their own lives? And we do that looking at three areas. Public services, so the focus is on how can government interventions enable people to develop their own solutions individually and collectively. We do it in education, where we're interested in how can we change education so that it's more about creative learners, creative teachers and creative systems. And we do it in the area of the economy, where we're interested in how can we have an economy that is growing and sustainable, but also an economy which maximises people's scope to be economic agents, to feel that their work and their lives are meaningful. So for example, we've done a lot of work on self-employment, a lot of work on making, a lot of work on organisational change, how it is you can have radically more decentralised and autonomous organisations. So we do all that kind of research, we've got lots of clever people, but we also have kind of emphasis on innovation on the ground and experimentation on the ground. We, for example, sponsor a group of academy schools in the West Midlands. And then we've got our fellowship. And so what we've been trying to do is to say, and it's really hard, it's been really, really hard, but we've got there now, is to say, how can we combine all these different resources into a model of change? So when we look at a problem now, what we do is we really think hard about what the nature of that problem is. We don't assume we know what the problem is. One of the most powerful quotes much repeated though it is I think it was Mark Twain, wasn't it, who said to a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So how do we avoid saying, well, the problem must be a problem related to the resource that we've got? And say, no, actually, is this a problem about policy? Is this a problem about public discourse? Is this a problem about innovation? Is this a problem about mobilisation? Is this a problem about collaboration? Is this a problem about technology, data? What is the nature of this problem? And it's enabling us now to put together really interesting ways of working that combine those resources, and at its best combines them in a really dynamic way. So what you do is you're setting out a process of change, and as that process of change develops, you pull these different resources in along the way to accelerate it and to widen it and to expand it. And it feels to me, having worked in politics and a think tank for many, it's incredibly exciting to be able to do that. It's a mixture of ideas that I love and research that I love, but it's also about campaigning and mobilisation, and it's also about pizzazz. It's about marketing. It's about how things look. It's about making ideas really attractive and exciting and accessible to people. So I'll give you one example of this in practice to finish with. We were approached by the Heritage Lottery Fund a while ago to do some thinking about heritage, and it's partly in the context of austerity. So if you go to local government and you say, how important is investment in heritage to you right now? Most local authorities will say, well, we'd love to, but it's really, really not that important in comparison to our collapsing social care systems or our potholes in our roads, or whatever else it might be, child protection or whatever. So the traditional answer to that would be, well, let's make a better case for heritage. Let's kind of make a case that heritage is good for tourism, or that heritage can be used to tackle some other social problem that people take more seriously, like reducing crime or something like that. And that's fine, that's all good stuff. But we wanted to look more deeply than that. So what we did was our initial piece of work was we went to 3 places where we were able to call on our fellows, who will often be kind of leaders locally in a variety of contexts. And we asked them about heritage, and we asked them, how important is heritage to you in what is often called place shaping? So in terms of the kind of thinking about the future of this place as a whole, how important is heritage to that? And what we discovered throughout that process was really interesting, I thought. What we found was that the problem for heritage wasn't really a problem for heritage. The problem for heritage was a problem of identity. So it turned out that places had a real difficulty about talking about identity when they talked about their future. So they talked about their future in terms of economic development and housing and all these kind of things. When you said, but what is distinctive about Bristol or Leeds or Manchester or Birmingham? What is distinctive about your account of place? The answer was often very, very superficial. And I think there's a lot of different reasons for this. And some of them is just a kind of lack of thinking. I think some of it is that there is a tendency for people to try to copy what the best place has done. So if you look at urban development over the last 30 years, there's been a kind of, there was a time that it was called Starbucks and Stadia, where everyone said the answer to urban development is to have a sports arena and a shopping mall. So that was Starbucks and Stadia. Then in Britain we had biotech and ballet, which is the answer to urban regeneration is to have science parks and culture. And all those things are great, but why would you expect those things to work in every different place, So that's part of it. But actually I think there's something else as well that's interesting, and that is, I got this off Charlie Lebby, who's a friend of mine, did some work in London on how people on low incomes in London feel about life. And we were chatting, because I made a television programme about 15 years ago, called I'm Not Racist But. And this was a programme about people who say, I'm not racist but, and then kind of go on to say that they're really not happy about diversity. Anyway, Charlie said people don't say I'm not racist but anymore, because they kind of think that I'm not racist but is code for I am racist so they don't really say that because it's a bit outmoded. What they now say is there's been a lot of change around here. So the code phrase for, I'm worried about all these strange people moving into my neighbourhood and how quickly it's changing, and the Polish shop and Somalians who've moved into our neighbourhood, whatever it might be, is there's been a lot of change around here. And I'm not, by the way, I'm not attacking people who say that. I think that, you know, it is really difficult and challenging for you if the area that you live in is changing quickly. But I think that's part of the reason why people worry about talking about identity. Because they worry that a conversation about identity will lead to there's been a lot of change around here kind of conversation, which is identity is something we had and now it's kind of been taken away from us because of all this change and diversity. It turns out that's nonsense. It turns out that newcomers to places are actually even more enthusiastic and excited about this distinctive local identity of the place they've moved to than people who've lived there for years. So, but it's an understandable inhibition. Anyway, so we found this first bit of work, so that was really interesting. And then we thought, so we've got something good here. We've got something good, which is that actually, if you could put identity at the heart of place shaping, then heritage will naturally follow. Because if place leaders say, part of our story about our place has got to be what's different about it, what's distinctive about it, they're immediately going to say heritage. Wow, that's really important for us because that's got loads of stuff in it about, especially if it's a kind of broad account of heritage, not just old buildings, but you know, oral histories and cultural norms, and also, of course, you know, migrant groups and what they've brought and all that. So if it's that kind of rich account of heritage, it's absolutely essential. So that was interesting. And then we thought, well, this is great, and people who are really interested in this stuff like it, but it's not got much sex appeal, really. It's a bit, you know, it's a bit abstract, it's a bit conceptual. How can we make it more real? So what we did then was we compiled, by mashing up 100 data sets, a heritage index for Britain. So if you go to the RSA website, you can find this. So you can move your cursor on this rather clever map, and it will tell you where every place in the country features in terms of a set of 7 different measures of heritage assets, and also a number of different measures of participation in heritage. So we just mashed together data like blue plaques and historic buildings and protected spaces, and there are websites where people put on things that they think are historically significant. So a whole variety of different stuff. And we published that. It's funny, it's kind of been fascinating. Basically, it's really churned people up. So actually, I've just got an email as I was walking up here that Warrington Council, so we were condemned by Warrington Council because Warrington came bottom. Right? So that we were condemned by them, and I got a phone call also from somewhere in the northeast, I can't remember exactly where, from a phone-in, because the council there passed a motion of censure against the RSA. And this DJ said, you must be, you know, the presenter said, you must be so upset that they, you know, that you've been condemned for your research being so inaccurate, and people are so angry with you. And I said, first of all, well, I'm not really upset about the research being wrong because it's all in the public domain. We just mashed together 100 data sets, so, you know, it's not our research, it's just a way of putting everything we can, and it's a continuous learning process, and we're really happy to learn new data sets that we can include, so, but you can interrogate the data. But secondly, I said, I'm absolutely over the moon that you're having a big row about heritage. I mean, what a fantastic thing. That, you know, motions of censure are being passed about places saying, no, our heritage is great. And our lead researcher went to Warrington 2 weeks ago to a lively public meeting about Warrington's heritage. And people said to him, it's disgusting that you said our heritage is rubbish. And so Jonathan said, well, look, these are the data sets we used, and this is how it came out. And, you know, really interested to learn what we missed and what we might include because we want to do it again. And after he'd done that, people were kind of okay. And then what people said was, well, what we're going to do is we're going to set up an action group in Warrington. We're setting up a heritage action group because what we're going to do is we're going to celebrate our heritage and we're going to discover new heritage, and we're going to argue that heritage ought to be a much bigger part of the Warrington story. Well, bingo is what I say. Bingo, big time, yeah? And the RSA has created now a whole network of heritage champions all around Britain who are using this work to open up this debate, not using it primarily, I hope, to say, you know, give another few £1,000s to the ailing local museum, but to say more ambitiously, how can we see heritage as a strategic resource for us as a place in terms of trying to create a really vibrant, distinctive future for ourselves and everyone who lives in this area. So that's what we've done, and I think it's absolutely great. And I think that what I would finish with is really this, and I don't know how relevant it is to you and what you're doing, but maybe it'll be relevant to you in your future lives if it's not relevant to you immediately now. And that is, I think, if we want to achieve change, we have to be willing to really be radically different about the things that we do. We have to look at whether or not our organisation is really focused on the mission that it's got, or whether it's just doing the stuff that it's always done in the past and the stuff that it's good at. And I think that's very hard for a lot of institutions. I don't think universities are very good at it as institutions, to be honest. I think universities at the moment are all kind of chasing after a set of metrics that have been imposed on them from the outside. And I always want to say when I go to universities, just stop. And yeah, you've got all this noise, and yes, you've got all these metrics, and yes, you've got all this regulation, but nevertheless, what is it at heart what is your model of change for the world? You know, there's all the individual things you're doing, but overall, what is your kind of way of understanding how you, as an institution committed to progressive change in the world, committed to the wonderful goal of educating people and research and all that, how could you really articulate this? What could you do differently? So it's a hard conversation to have. It's easy to have in the RSA. We've only got 150, 130 staff. The university is a massive undertaking, but I think universities are examples of institutions that find it quite hard to have that conversation about how they might radically change themselves to be more powerful in the world. But that's what I think we need to do. So I think our way of thinking about change needs to get away from saying change is about a set of levers called policy or campaigning. I could give you an equally long and boring talk about how I think most campaigning is self-indulgent and pointless. But we need to move away from that kind of set of levers and instead really think deeply about what the nature of the problem is, and then be very brave and willing to change the way in which we do things and our organisations do things in order that our activities have got a really great chance of making a difference with people, not to people. Thank you.
Perhaps you could give us a bit of an abridged rant of how we could do of what's the difference between effective campaigning in for you and why it's self-indulgent. I'm not disagreeing with you.
My problem with campaigning is that it's kind of, well, a number of things. But first of all, it's kind of premised on, actually, it's kind of flip side of the policymaker's view of the world, because it's premised on the fact if only I could change this one thing, then everything would be fine. And that's generally speaking not true. And I think secondly, campaigning is just so much easier than developing an alternative way of doing things. And so I think people campaign because what is implicit in a lot of campaigning is it's not my responsibility to actually try to make change happen. I'm going to blame someone else for not making change happen. Right? That's what's implicit. Not in all of it, but in a lot of it. But the most problematic thing about campaigning, I think, a lot of campaigning, again, not all of it, is that, and there's research to show this, if you get people together and you say we're campaigning against something, the council, the government, or whatever, and then having had that campaign, and maybe even won it, you then try and get that group of people to turn into a group of people who say, okay, let's come up with some solutions. It's almost impossible to do, because the logic of solution creation is completely different to the logic of campaigning. The logic of campaigning kind of gives you a single thing you can all aim towards and a banner you can all get behind. Making solutions is about having a load of disparate views and being able to persist with something and stick at something. So, I've campaigned, and it's important that we do campaign. And, I'd be in Paris if I had the time, now, campaigning, because I think certain times you just need to put pressure on decision makers to take things more seriously, and campaigning is a vital part of our democracy. But I think quite a lot of campaigning is self-indulgent. I think quite a lot of campaigning is an alternative to the more important business, which is how is it you actually engage people in thinking about making change themselves.
Yeah. I was at a conference on public engagement in Bristol the last couple of days, and we did lots of group work, and one of the things we were asked to do was to think about what is the most radical way that you can imagine your university would be prepared to incorporate public engagement into its structures. And people came up with nicely crazy stuff to do with VC job shares with the local headmistress or whatever. Are there particular, do you think public engagement for universities would be an important mechanism for achieving this kind of openness to change? And if so, do you have any thoughts about how it might work?
Yeah, I do. And funnily enough, I'm a member of a commission that's been set up by Warwick University to look at how Warwick University can make a better contribution to its locality, sub-region and region. And that's proved to be a very interesting piece of work. Because it's not quite clear whether we should be an independent commission saying things the university might ignore, or we should be a commission that's giving the university things they're likely to. I'm slightly confused about that. I think there are a lot of ways in which you can answer it, and I think so. I'll just tell you what we've come up with. So we've come up with 3 domains really. So the first is leadership and vision, and what we've said there is university leaders should have the success of their locality as one of their performance targets. So when they're judged, they shouldn't just be judged on, you know, ref outcomes and student numbers and all that, and the size of the university, number of new buildings, etc., etc. They should actually have a performance target which relates to the success of the local place. Yeah. So that's the kind of the first question is the institution genuinely at the senior level committed to the fact that it's not succeeding if the place it's in isn't succeeding? And then secondly, we're looking at the issue of collaboration and how generous is the university as an organisation working with other organisations. So I'll give you an example of what we're thinking about there is that, God knows whether we've succeeded in this, but universities really milk their alumni and they milk them for money, basically. And actually in universities, the head of the alumni office is quite a big and powerful figure, especially in the kind of Russell Group universities where they can get a lot of money out of it. So what we've said to the alumni office, this is all, by the way, not for repeating, because I don't know if any of it's going to get to final report, is how would it be if you used that alumni to help the locality in general? So if, for example, the local health service had a big issue and it needed some adaptation of government policy, could they come to you and say, are there any senior Department of Health civil servants who used to go to Warwick University? Because we could just email them and say, you know, you used to live around here, so you'll understand this issue. And so I have no idea whether that would succeed. I mean, I can't imagine there'll be that much enthusiasm because they're totally focused on raising money, but actually if you're committed to your place, you should use your resource, and one of the best resources that universities have got is their alumni. And then the third area is just about good citizenship, which is just a kind of sensitivity to the way in which things that universities do, some of which are great, have externalities. So for example in Warwick, all the students go and live in Leamington, and Leamington is kind of basically turned into Studentsville, which is all right in many ways, it's good for local economy, but it can be problematic in terms of local people feeling that the place is just kind of like terribly youth oriented and a bit out of control on Friday and Saturday nights and stuff like that. So, you know, what can you do to remind people who are living there for 3 years that some people have been living there for 30 years or 40 years and have that? So I think my overall point is just to take it genuinely seriously, and I don't think I think broadly speaking, and this is a generalisation, the more academically successful universities, the less seriously it takes its commitment to place. So first of all, take it seriously, and then secondly, you need to work in a kind of whole variety of domains, I think. The problem at the moment is whenever you say to university what you're doing about your locality, they'll give you about 50 great things, but they're not coordinated, and there's no sense of their scale, so it's all a little bit tokenistic, which is why I think that kind of leadership thing is really important.
You said before about help, politicians ask for help from civil society in general. How exactly do you describe this help? I mean, can civil society participate in decision making as well, or just consultation or something like that?
Well, I gave the example of the child poverty thing. So I think the first thing about saying help is just a recognition from politicians and leaders in general, by the way, that, you know, overwhelmingly the things that one wants to achieve as a leader of an organisation or as a politician rely on other people making a contribution. So that recognition is the first step. And then I think you need to say what specifically is that help? What's that help involve? But I think it can be transformative. So I was at an event in Essex about a year ago, and it had a really big impression on me because this was the local strategic partnership. So it was kind of local public service, voluntary sector, business leaders from Essex. And I'd been asked to go and do a talk about collaboration. So I went and gave a talk about collaboration. And I was just kind of lingering because I thought I'd wait to the coffee break, not to be rude to go off. And immediately after me was the chief executive of a local care commissioning group, so commissioning part of the health service. And she got up to do a presentation and she said, she'd asked a presentation on the health service in 10 years. And she said, just as she was getting her laptop, getting the slides up, she said, I'm sorry if this presentation isn't very polished, but I've just had the hardest week of my professional career. And she just described very briefly before the presentation, you know, ambulances queuing up outside A&E, old people being sent home at midnight to empty flats, her worry about the fact that if a flu or norovirus outbreak came along, they just couldn't cope. And she said all this in passing, and then she was about to go into a presentation, and by the way, the reason I tell this story is I come out of it rather well. I said, even though I was a guest, I said, hold on, I said, we just had a conversation about collaboration, and you've got a colleague standing in front of you in real professional pain, and you're just going to kind of glance over it. So, to his credit, the chairman of the council, leader of the council sitting next to me said, no, Matthew's absolutely right. That's what I mean about me coming out with the story very well. We're going to break. And so there was a break, and I went outside to make a phone call, and when I came in, this woman was standing, and she had around her half a dozen people with clipboards who were writing down the things that they were going to do to help her. So, you know, the local authority chief executive was going to write to all the staff saying, make sure you get a flu vaccine, get a flu jab. The local voluntary service people said, we'll send volunteers to A&E at midnight so there's someone to go back home with these older people. So there's a whole variety of things. And I went back to Essex 6 months later, and there's a whole group of people I met, but she was one of them, and she said to me, it's still the case 6 months later that my colleagues in other care commissioning groups in Essex still say to me, how is it you've managed to get all this kind of collaboration? It's amazing. And it was simply because she asked for help. And it's just an incredibly powerful thing to do. And one of the reasons, I wrote a blog 2 days ago about collaboration, and I said that one of the barriers, I've talked about 3 barriers to collaboration, I said one of the barriers is inhibition. It's that people, collaboration is about trust, it's about empathy, it's about love, actually. How are you going to sum up that stuff if you don't look someone in the eye and say, I need your help, or look someone in the eye and say, I'd like to help you? And I've spent far too much time in places that are supposed to be collaborative, and there's just no emotion in the room. Well, then you're not going to get much out of it. It's going to be mechanical. No one else? Anyway, so look, thank you for asking me. The RSA is a truly amazing organisation, and I encourage you, if you haven't done already, to go to our website and to look at our content and our lectures and our stuff. We had an amazing day before yesterday, which was a Makers Day, so we had a whole day dedicated to making. We've got a maker space down in the City of London, and it was just fantastic, all these makers, and we had Richard Sennett talking about craft. It was just the most fantastic day. So we do amazing stuff at the RSA, and it's great if you're a fellow, but if you're a student, you probably might not be able to afford the fellowship fees, but if you share our values, think about fellowship, but even if you don't, all our stuff is free anyway, but so just enjoy. We are an amazing organisation, and over the next 18 months, I think because we have really changed ourselves in order to be as powerful as we can be, I think the RSA is really going to take off. So you've heard it here first.